What's up, guys? I'm gonna switch subjects here and we'll get back to volcanic ash. That's pretty well gonna deserve its own playlist because it may not seem like it, but there's a lot to it. It's done everything from shaping whole landscapes to they found what's now a modern day tourist attraction temple completely buried in ash. But honestly, I get on a subject, start looking at it from all different angles, and by the time I'm ready to make a video, I'm sick of even thinking about it. So let's talk about timelines here. Has it really been 1500 years since the fall of the Roman Empire? For that matter, was the Roman Empire even real? The fall of the ancients. We have the archaeological ruins of these sites all around the world, protected by UNESCO, which every UNESCO World Heritage Site is the scene of an accident. But then history just goes dark, hence the name the Dark Ages. There's not only the fact that power abhors a vacuum, I think it's said. Somebody would have been seizing power of everything. Anyway, not only is there only a handful of like 24 volumes of books written by some supposed monks throughout the Dark Ages, and that's all we have, but there is zero archaeological evidence of the cultures that live there. So that's what we're really going to get into with this book, A Guide to the Phantom Dark Age. There's a whole lot of good info in here, way more than I'm going to get into in one video. So I'll just make a playlist and kind of add to it as time goes on, bounce back and forth. Now, it's general YouTube lore that there's been 1,000 years added to the calendar, and it sounds about right to me. One of the reasons for that is Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko, who wrote a new chronology. They list him here as a pseudo sea theorist. I better not even say that. But he dated ancient events based off of things like lunar and solar eclipses and compared them with the exact area that the people in the story were at and said that this could have only happened at this date. And he says everything, the further you go back in history, the further it gets off. And he calced out that the time of Christ was, I think, 1065 AD. That's using our modern dating system, of course, based off of the birth of Christ. Anyway, there's not only that, but just with my own research, this is what I see when I look at history. Around, you know, they stretch it out for about 200 years, but from 300 AD to 500 AD, you've got all these earthquakes, comets, plague. Ultimately, you lose what they say is about 50 million people. Well, then everything goes dark for 800 years, and all of a sudden, there's another catastrophe with earthquakes and comets, and there's droughts and plagues and flooding, all kinds of weird stuff going on during these events. Was it the same event? And then did they just add a bunch of time? Because when you look at history, we've all heard history repeats itself. Well, it rhymes too, because a lot of these histories seem to be the same story told over and over. But keep in mind that no matter what history that you're looking at it from, whether it's mainstream or the way I view things, it's just different reasons, but a huge portion of the population was killed off. And since then, there's been numerous conquests and consolidation of power, and filtering down to the Encyclopedia Britannica is what we all get taught for what was 700 years ago. And the term Dark Age is credited to Petrarch right at that time of those catastrophes, 14th century. During the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment, men such as Voltaire and Kant saw the whole of what we now call the Middle Ages as a period of faith, and thus the opposite of Enlightenment, because they're all about the science and Darwinism and all that. But were they right? Was there a period of 800 years in there of just faith? Was there the 1,000 years of Christ? What happened? I mean, did people just build big, huge cathedrals and not write anything down not have any songs or poems of the great heroes of the time. It's the Dark Ages. What happened? Well, let's talk about the archaeological evidence of those cathedrals and everything. By the 19th century, it had become increasingly evident that it was impossible to classify everything between the end of the Western Empire and the Renaissance as a dark age. For one thing, it was found that the Roman civilization did not come to an end in 1476, not even in the West. The barbarian princes who had taken control of the western provinces in the 5th century were not the mindless destroyers it had once been believed. On the contrary, they adopted Roman civilization as quickly as they could and did everything in their power to uphold Roman institutions and customs. They also continued, by and large, to regard themselves as functionaries of the empire and minted gold coins emblazoned with the image of Emperor Constantine, Emperor of Constantinople. So look at it this way. What if, by some miracle, something happened right now to where the whole UN broke down? The central power structure officially gets erased from history, but all of the people of Spain and France, they all still live there. So then he says they continued to build monuments in the Roman style. These chiefly comprised luxury churches, but also included impressive secular buildings. It was recognized, for example, that the medieval cathedrals represented an advance on Roman architecture, and it was conceded that the Romans would have been incapable of building such structures. Indeed, in many areas of technology, the Middle Ages were more advanced and sophisticated than classical Rome, and we need only cite the enormous lists of technologies employed by the people of medieval Europe which were unknown to the Romans. These included windmill, paper, the plow collar, the stirrup, horseshoe, new musical instruments such as the violin and bagpipe. He lists a couple others, but then says that these were followed in the 12th to 15th centuries by mechanical clocks, magnifying lenses, and a whole gamut of architectural innovations, as well as such epoch-making innovations as gunpowder and firearms and the printing press. So let me just give you academia's view on the progression of technology, and you see if this sounds plausible to you. The ancients only had very simple machines like Archimedes' screw and Hero's engine, the simple steam engine, but nothing too complex. We go from that to a period where there is zero history for this society, and they invent the windmill and musical instruments and all of these things. And then you have the printing press and cannons and firearms come on the scene all at the same time. And somehow everything before that, I mean, just look at what they're doing with information right now. I mean, take any subject that's actually happening and look at the mainstream narrative of it, and they're twisting literally everything. So this has been going on since the first use, apparently, of mass media. And then cannons completely changed warfare, because then any coastal city you can pull up off of their coast and just sit there and start destroying buildings until they finally say, okay, what do you want? And the birth of colonization. It makes much more sense to me that all of these things happened in a much shorter frame of time, and just one thing built on top of another, just like it has up till modern day. So after this dark age of no writing, no nothing coming out, then such great figures as the 13th century Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus made advances in mathematics, experimented with light and the nature of properties of chemicals, and theorized on the size of the solar system. All this wealth of knowledge, these guys didn't just come up with that out of thin air. It was built upon, just like everybody else builds on other people's theories. Anyway, it will be seen that a broad sweep of the archaeological investigation over the past century has signally failed, much to the exasperation of the excavators, to produce anything substantial For the 3 centuries between 615 and 915 AD. Every single structure in the world, according to the official dating, is either before 615 or after 915. They didn't even bother trying to date anything to this period. Even in sites that were occupied apparently continuously from the Roman period to the medieval, and there are very many of them, material for the 3 dark centuries is mysteriously missing. Even worse, the settlements of the early 7th century lie immediately underneath those from the early 10th without any intermediate gap, and the material culture of the two epochs shows striking signs of continuity. Were historians not saddled with chronological considerations, they would have had no hesitation in proclaiming the 10th century settlements to be the direct successors of those of the 7th. 10th century art and architecture, as expressed most eloquently in the early Romanesque, looks to all intents and purposes like the direct successor of the late Roman styles of the Merovingians and Visigoths. The evidence of archaeology proves it, and so do the written sources. Everywhere there are echoes, events, and characters of the 7th century which reappear in the 10th century somewhat with a minor name change. The Ural Altaic speaking Avars, for example, who take possession of the Hungarian plain in the late 6th century, look very much like the Ural Altaic speaking Magyars who take possession of the Hungarian plain in the late 9th century. The Langobards or Lombards, who we find in possession of Italy in the early 7th century, seem very much like the Lombards, who we find in possession of Italy at the start of the 10th. The Frankish Merovingians of the 6th and early 7th centuries seem to reappear in the Frankish Carolingians of the 9th and 10th centuries. Even in the Islamic world, we find the same phenomena. The Muslim conquest of northern India by Muhammad bin Qasim around 710 sounds uncannily like the Muslim conquest of northern India by Muhammad of Ghazni around 1010. Again, the Reconquista of Spain against the invading Moors is said to have commenced with the victory of Don Pelayo in northern Spain around 718, but the real Conquista had to wait another 3 centuries to materialize with the victories of Roger de Tony in 1018, exactly 300 years apart on all of those. It is as if history had terminated in the early 7th century, then recommenced without any appreciable disruption or disturbance in the 10th. Now, let's talk about the calendar a little bit. The late Roman world, contrary to popular belief, did not in fact employ the Anno Domini calendar, a system which only came into use in the 11th century. It is true that upon converting to Christianity, the Romans did begin to use the Bible as a chronological guide, but the calendar they adopted began with the creation of the world, which the Old Testament placed anywhere between 5,500 and 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. Just incidentally, that's the same calendar that the Freemasons use. They've got their own calendar. Well, I guess it's not their own if other people are using it, but also the Jewish calendar is based off of the time of creation. When the Romans did adopt Christianity in the latter 4th century, believers were not very much interested in when Jesus was born. Their attention was focused far more on when he would return, as he had promised. The computations of Dionysius Exegius, blah, blah. By the first half of the 7th century, therefore, very few people had any knowledge of the number of years that had elapsed since the birth of Christ. Now, I think that is true, but then it leads to the question of, okay, then who did institute that it's been so many years since Christ, and why did they do it? Well, if people were more concerned about when he was going to return than when he was born, then if you pushed it back 1,000 years, then it'd seem like, well, you guys are just going to keep waiting forever, aren't you? Just a thought. Now, it's well understood that when medieval kings needed a precedent, they simply invented one. In this, Otto I was no different from his contemporaries. A previous Germanic emperor of the West was needed, so one was created, and thus was born the myth of Charlemagne. I've been saying this for years now, and it's good to read somebody else actually saying it, because my whole view on the whole Holy Roman Empire and everything is they invented a bloodline just to be the successors of that bloodline. After the collapse of society and all the dust settled, literally and figuratively, and people were able to eat again and worry about more things than just trying to survive, well, then somebody comes to power, and after a generation or so, well, hey, this line of kings goes back for 1,000 years. They're divinely ordained. Now, on a little side note, I'm not going to give it away, but I found in my research that Charlemagne has way, way too much in common with another historical figure for it to be coincidence, but I'll get to that eventually. Yet the Carolingian kings, for whom little or no archaeological evidence has been found, which were much honored by Otto I and his successors, is well known. And if one is to create a fictitious German emperor, such a figure, along with his ancestors and progeny, would need 2 or 3 centuries in which to reign, and one would therefore be involved in a general distortion of chronology. I was reading a book a while back that was from the early 1800s, discussing some of the first people that came over to America from England, and saying that whoever that king was at the time, it was whatever he said was absolute total law. So this has happened through several such regimes throughout history, to where whatever the boss says is the truth. So it just became I am the great great grand nephew of Charlemagne the Great, and you are automatically entitled. There's your entitlement that everybody in the media is looking for right there. It ain't got nothing to do with me. But according to this researcher, Otto III ordered the creation of an extra 3 centuries of history, which was then inserted between Otto I's epoch and the Roman age. In the new chronology invented by the Ottonian emperors, Otto I was not then crowned in 662, but in 692. I do kind of find it interesting that he's still using the AD dating system, but what else can you do? For me personally, I count backwards from our present time, and I'll have to do a timeline at some point for you guys, but it's confusing to try to explain it. Anyway, I think that'll serve as a good introduction to the subject. So there you go. I mean, moral of the story is you can take 300 years off of our calendar and just completely throw it out the window, because it was all made up by Otto III to justify his place as Holy Roman Emperor and his whole family. So what happens to the chronology on the world history scale when you have this guy that he lied about this over here, and then over in Spain, this guy, well, he had to justify his throne, and this guy, you know what I'm saying? And then since that time, you've had the Reformation and the Catholic Protestant wars, and then you had the Spanish Empire basically conquer the world, and then you had basically the English Empire conquer the world. So ultimately, what we're left with is the ruins and still standing monuments of a very skilled, advanced society. Many great artworks, unbelievable, carvings, progression of technology of through windmills and musical instruments and all these things, and there's no written record of it. How convenient. Now, taking into account that even mainstream is telling us that millions and millions of people died 700 years ago, somewhere around there. I think it could have been sooner, but I'm just going to go with the 700 years. They say it was all the Black Death, but I present a lot of research showing, I mean, for instance, there was one flood alone that was said to have killed like 4 million people in China. Mountains fell in and new lakes formed. One of them was 300 miles in circumference. So, taking into account that there were events large enough to cause a complete societal collapse, there's two ways I can look at this. One, you have the progression of mankind, technology, and everything up until a big event occurs. And for a short period of time, it really rattles the world, like maybe for 3 or 4 generations. And then they're trying to pick back up where they left off. If this happened today, not everybody can make a television, but people know bits and pieces of it, and you may be able to re-engineer it eventually. That's a pretty extreme analogy for what I'm talking about, is the building technologies progressing and things like the windmill and mechanics evolving into the clock and things like that. And everything is still progressing without a centralized power. For a couple of hundred years, the world can do a lot in a couple hundred years. Just keep in mind that America is only a few hundred years old. And in that time, the Catholic Church basically takes control of all knowledge and of all things historical. And for some reason, them and the society decide to push everything back 1,000 years. That's scenario one. And in that scenario, I'm literally talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the ancients just 700 years ago. And they've really screwed with our heads about things. In scenario two, life's rolling along, and then the fall of the Roman Empire, and then the Justinian plague. And I guess it really shook everybody up, because after that, they didn't read or write anything but the Bible, and all they did is build cathedrals. And there's flat out 300 years of zero archaeological evidence to collaborate with the 300 years the historians are telling us was there. The only literate people were the clergy, and there was really, well, I guess there was some technological innovation created with the time, the windmill and whatnot. But they were smart enough to sit down and design windmills, but they didn't really have a writing system that was widely used. And during this whole period of building these massive, expensive cathedrals, there was no power grab for centralized power or anything like that. It was just little nation states. So maybe it just put the fear of God into everybody, and they said, no, that old empirical system is wrong, so we're not going to do it, which would be great. It just doesn't sound likely to me. I mean, diamond mines in remote Africa bring out warlords, you know what I'm saying? And then there was a second catastrophe where millions died. I mean, we're talking a third of the population by official numbers. And then you have the advent and power of the printing press, the mass media that, just like today, no matter how loud we scream that they are full of crap, they keep repeating their same lies. How long's that been going on? But I don't know. Seriously, when I look at those two options, and maybe there's a third, if you guys can think of one, let me know. But the first one actually seems more likely to me, that a catastrophe struck and centralized power lost its grip over mankind. And there were enough engineers and farmers and architects that all survived, and they just kept progressing slower than before, but they just kept doing their thing. And then it was, 100, 200, 300 years of decentralized nation states that eventually all got picked off one by one by a big power that has changed the histories. Hope you guys enjoyed. See you on the next one.